I used to hike alone a lot, not because I was some seasoned survivalist or chasing some romantic notion of becoming one with nature. Honestly, it was just the only time I felt like I could get my head straight. The stress, the noise, the constant digital noise that never shuts up when you're home, it disappeared the moment I got out into the woods. It was like the air out there wasn't just cleaner, it was quieter, like it washed the mess out of my thoughts. I was 24 when this happened. I was living in northwestern North Carolina at the time, just outside of Boone. If you're familiar with the area, you know it's full of winding roads, thick woods, and forgotten hiking trails that feel like they haven't seen a person in years. I had a few favorites, and I used to rotate between them. There was one in particular I liked for long day hikes. It had no name on the map, no signage on the roadside, just a thin pull-off and a gap in the trees that opened into forest. I'd found it the way most locals found spots like that, word of mouth and boredom. I'd probably been out there half a dozen times before that day, and every time I did, I saw no one. No cars, no campers, no fresh boot prints in the dirt. Just overgrown trail markers, deer paths, and pine needles that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. That was part of the appeal. It was quiet and completely off the radar. That day started like any other. It was early October, right in that perfect sweet spot where the leaves were changing but the air wasn't too cold yet. It was clear out, sun shining, barely any wind, and not a cloud in sight. I left around 10 a.m., parked in the usual spot on the shoulder of the old two-lane road, locked up my car, slung my pack on, and started in. I packed light, just a water bladder, granola bars, my folding knife, and a small flashlight in case I was dumb and ended up out there after dark. The first few hours were uneventful. Just me and the trail, birdsong, the occasional squirrel, some old trail switchbacks with leaves up to my ankles. Around mile 5 or 6, I reached a ridge that I'd always turned back from in the past. It wasn't marked, but the trees thinned out, and the path started to descend again on the other side. That day, since I'd gotten an earlier start than usual, I decided I'd keep going, just to see what was down there. Maybe make it a loop if it reconnected somewhere. I remember the air felt cooler the moment I crossed that ridge. Not in a dramatic way, but enough to notice. The kind of change that makes you pause and wonder if you're about to step into shade or if there's something coming with the weather. But the sky was still clear, sun still shining, so I just zipped my jacket up and kept going. The trail dropped down into a narrow valley, and the trees changed, denser, older, lots more undergrowth. Everything felt tighter, like the woods were closing in. Still nothing that screamed danger, just a change. The trail started to fade the farther I went. It wasn't gone completely, but it got harder to follow. The ground was soft and untraveled. A few times I had to stop and look around to make sure I hadn't wandered off. I checked for broken branches, pushed down grass, the faint depression of human boots. It was all barely there, like no one had walked it in years. I was maybe 2 hours past the ridge when I came across something that made me stop. A boot print, clear, recent. The heel had kicked up wet soil, and the imprint was still clean. I crouched down to look at it and realized there were more, one set, heading the same direction I was. Not old prints, not mine. Someone else was out here. I didn't really think much of it at first. This public land. Someone else found the same trail, maybe even knew it better than I did. I figured I'd probably catch up to them, maybe pass them. I kept walking, a little more alert now, listening more than before. Another 20 minutes passed. The trail dropped again, steeper this time, and curved sharply to the left. I turned the corner and stopped dead in my tracks. There was a fire ring just off the trail. Not a new one, old rocks, old burn marks. But what caught my eye was the tarp. Blue, standard hardware store kind, strung between 2 trees in a crude lean-to. Next to it was a trash bag tied shut, half hanging off a branch. It wasn't billowing in the breeze or anything. It looked heavy, full. I stood still, just watching. No movement, no sound, no gear left out, no smoke, no smell of fire, just that tarp and the bag. I knew I had 2 choices, keep walking or turn back. But then I heard something, a thump, not loud, not close, but real. It came from somewhere behind the tarp, farther into the trees. A single heavy sound, like a log dropping or a boot hitting the ground. I didn't freeze. I backed up slowly, heart pounding, scanning the tree line. Still no movement, still no voices, just the wind and my own pulse in my ears. I didn't call out. I didn't want to. Everything in my gut told me that if I announced myself, I'd regret it. So I turned around and walked fast. Not a sprint, not a panic run. Just fast and steady, like I was late for something. The woods felt darker going back. I kept glancing over my shoulder. First, I didn't see anything, just trees. Then, maybe 15 minutes later, I caught movement. A flash of blue between the trunks. The tarp? No, it was too close, too high. Then I saw the shape behind it. Someone was following me. They weren't rushing. They weren't trying to catch up. Just keeping pace, staying just far enough back that I couldn't see them clearly. Every time I rounded a bend or crossed through thicker brush, they vanished. Every time the woods opened back up, they reappeared. Always the same distance behind. I kept walking. My pace turned into a jog. Then I started running. Branches hit my arms and face. My boots slipped on wet leaves. I didn't stop. Couldn't. At some point, I lost the trail. I realized it after I crossed a dry creek bed that I didn't recognize. The trees looked wrong. The slope was wrong. I stopped and spun in a slow circle, trying to find anything familiar. Then I heard it again. Not footsteps, not a voice. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing. Coming from somewhere just beyond the tree line. Close. Way too close. I dropped to the ground, crawled behind a fallen log, and stayed there. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. The breathing grew louder, then stopped. Silence. Then slow footsteps, crunching, careful. Just a few. I stared through a gap in the log, waiting to see whoever it was step into view. But no one did. And then it stopped. Completely. The woods went silent again, like someone had turned the volume off. I stayed there for over an hour. I waited until the light started to die and the sky turned orange through the canopy. When I finally moved, I stood up slowly and picked a direction. Uphill. Always uphill. I figured if I could get high enough, maybe I'd find the ridge again, maybe even see the road. I hiked until it was nearly dark. The whole time, I didn't hear anything else. No breathing, no movement, no footsteps, just the wind picking up and the temperature dropping fast. Eventually, by some insane stroke of luck, I found the ridge again. I recognized a fallen tree with a branch shaped like a hook, and I knew I was close. I practically ran the last half-mile back to my car, tripping over rocks and roots, my lungs burning. When I saw my car still parked in that same dirt pull-off, I nearly cried. I got in, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, sweating through my jacket, staring at the woods like something was going to walk out and follow me home. Nothing did. I drove home without turning on the radio. I didn't speak to anyone for the rest of the day. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart still racing. The next morning, I called the sheriff's office. I didn't tell them everything, just that I'd been hiking and found what looked like an abandoned campsite that made me uncomfortable. They said they'd send someone to check it out. A week later, I called again. They said they hadn't found anything unusual. No signs of recent camping. No tarp. No bag. No fire ring. They said the area was clear. I haven't been back since. And I never will. I don't know who or what was out there, but they weren't camping. They weren't lost. They were watching. They were following. And they didn't want to be seen. When I tell the story to people, I always get the same response. That I did the right thing by leaving, that it was sketchy as hell, that they'd have done the same. And I agree, because something was off. Something was wrong. And I was lucky to get out when I did. I've always felt like I had the woods to myself. Where I live, there's a stretch of dense forest that runs just past the edges of town and rolls on for miles in every direction. There are trails marked by the local parks department, but after a few years of wandering out there on my own, I stopped using them. I started finding my own paths, little animal trails, dry creek beds, Thick undergrowth I'd push through just to see what was on the other side. It was my thing, my way to escape from everything for a few hours. Sometimes I'd go so late that I'd end up watching the sun rise through the trees. That kind of quiet, when the air is still cool and the sky turns pale before the sun shows up, is something that kept pulling me back again and again. I always brought a backpack, just some water, maybe a snack, and sometimes a little flashlight if I knew I'd be out past dark. But I didn't hike to survive or anything like that. I just liked moving, liked the way the town disappeared behind me after 10 minutes of walking. There were nights I'd hike for hours without ever seeing another person. So when I came across that place deep in the woods, it felt like I'd hit a wall that didn't belong out there. It was sometime after midnight. I didn't have a watch on me, but I remember the sky had gone past that deep blue into black, and I could only really see a few feet ahead of me without my flashlight. I hadn't planned to stay out late, but I'd gotten caught up exploring a dry ravine I hadn't noticed before. The floor of it was filled with old leaves and soft pine needles. It was one of those places where every step is quiet, even in boots. I had just started thinking I should head back when I saw the glow. It wasn't bright, more like an orange smear behind the trees up ahead. I thought maybe it was a campfire. Maybe someone else had the same idea I did, and I just stumbled on them out here. But as I got closer, I saw there were shadows, structures, uneven and crooked, silhouetted against the firelight. I stopped and looked around for a second, thinking maybe I'd veered near someone's private land, or maybe one of those illegal campsites you sometimes hear about. But there were no fences, no warning signs, just trees, and that orange glow bouncing off of whatever was built up in the clearing ahead. The smell hit me next, burning rubber, not strong enough to be choking, but just that sharp edge of something synthetic being cooked. I moved slower. My boots were quiet in the soft dirt, and I didn't want to spook whoever was out there. Then I stepped through the last layer of brush and saw it. A makeshift camp. A small shanty town, really. There were at least 8 or 9 little huts made from whatever material someone could find. Sheets of metal, plywood, plastic tarps, and heavy blankets stretched out and tied off between tree trunks. Some had furniture inside, old chairs and buckets and cracked plastic bins stacked with clothes or trash. One had a shopping cart next to it, stuffed with dirty blankets. Another had what looked like a car seat in front of it, like someone had ripped it out and made it into a recliner. And in the middle of it all was a fire, small but steady, burning in the hollowed-out frame of a car tire, smoke curling low under the trees. But there was no one around, not a single person.
No footsteps, no voices.
No movement, just that fire and the weird, quiet flicker it cast across everything. I remember just standing there for a while, waiting to hear something, anything. I expected footsteps, or the creak of someone shifting in one of the huts, or even the sound of someone sleeping. But there was nothing. I walked in slowly. Every step I took sounded too loud, like I was interrupting something. I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there, like I had stepped into a place I didn't belong. I went up to the fire. The rubber was almost all gone, so it wasn't flaming, just glowing. Hot coals in the tire's frame with little tongues of fire licking out now and then. Someone had tended it. Not long ago either. The sticks and bits of wood stacked nearby looked fresh. Some of the bark still had green on it. There were signs of people. Mugs left near the fire. A dirty pot with something crusted inside. A backpack half-zipped with a hoodie spilling out. The hoodie still looked clean, too. It hadn't been out long enough to gather any dust or moisture. Whatever this place was, it wasn't abandoned. Not permanently, anyway. I kept looking around. Each little hovel had its own setup, blankets, boxes, even hanging clothes. The kind of things you bring when you're planning to stay somewhere a while. One spot had a little plastic bin with children's toys in it. Action figures, broken plastic cars, a puzzle with pieces missing. But no people, and no signs of a sudden evacuation. No struggle. Nothing tipped over or left behind in panic. It was like they had just walked away. That's when the quiet started getting to me. It's hard to explain, but there's a difference between natural silence and forced silence. The woods are usually filled with little sounds. Wind, insects, the rustle of leaves. But here there was nothing. The air was still. The trees didn't move. Even the fire seemed to crackle quieter than it should have. I backed away. I didn't turn around and run or anything, but I walked out the way I came, keeping my pace even. I had this tight feeling in my chest, like something was watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that, but there's something about places like that, where things don't add up, that makes you start questioning everything you thought you understood. I hiked back using my flashlight, not bothering to try to save the battery. I just wanted to be out of those woods. My legs were shaking by the time I hit the trailhead, and when I got back to my car, I sat there for a long time before I even put the key in the ignition. That night, I barely slept. My mind kept going back to that fire. Why would someone go through the trouble of building all that, get a fire going, then just leave it, especially with all their stuff still there? The next day, I tried to shake it off. Told myself maybe it was just some squatters or a homeless camp. Maybe they went to get food or water. Maybe they were nearby and didn't want to confront a stranger walking into their space. It wasn't my business, really. I shouldn't have been out there anyway. Still, it gnawed at me. A week later, I went back during the day. Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't let it go. I had to see if it was still there. I retraced my steps, more carefully this time, and found the clearing again. But it was different. Everything was gone.
No huts.
No fire. No trash or clothes or furniture. Not even burn marks where the tire had been. The ground looked disturbed. Some indentations where structures might have stood. But otherwise, it was like the place had never existed. No signs of people.
No footprints.
No scattered items left behind. Just trees and dirt and silence. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. Someone had cleaned it all up. That much was clear. But why? And how did they move everything without leaving a single trace? On my way back, I passed a couple of guys walking a dog near one of the official trails. I thought about asking them if they'd seen anything out there. But what would I even say? That I found a ghost town in the woods that disappeared in a week? So I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. It's been over a year now since that night. I still hike, but not out that far anymore. I stay close to the trails, mostly stick to daylight. I've told myself 100 different versions of what I saw. A group of squatters who moved on. A survivalist group that didn't want to be found. Even a prank. Something set up to mess with people like me. But none of those explanations sit right. Not really, because no matter how many times I go over it in my head, I keep coming back to the fire. Someone was there. They built that place. They were warm, maybe eating, sitting around the fire. Then they left. But they didn't just leave. They vanished. And they took everything with them, except the smell. I swear, some nights when I'm out on the porch and the wind shifts just right, I catch a whiff of it again. That sharp, bitter scent of burning rubber and pine smoke. And it takes me right back to that night in the woods, standing in a camp made by people I never saw. And I never will. I've always liked being alone in the woods, not in the reckless, teenage, thrill-seeking kind of way. I'm not the type to post pictures from cliff edges or hike in sandals or anything like that. I'm not out there for adrenaline. I just like the quiet. Always have. I live in a small town that backs up to a big chunk of woods. Not a national park or anything official, just old forest that rolls across hills and valleys, slowly creeping up against farms and fields and forgotten side roads. It's easy to lose yourself out there, and for a long time, that's what I liked about it. I started hiking in those woods back in college. I'd head out alone most days after class or work and just walk, sometimes for hours. No destination. I carried a small backpack with the basics: water, flashlight, snack, first aid. Nothing major. I was familiar with the land, with the way it changed in the seasons, the little paths the deer used, the hollow trees and dry creek beds and spots where the moss stayed soft year-round. That's what made this whole thing worse, I think. I knew those woods. I trusted them. This happened in early fall, maybe mid-October. The days were still warm, but the nights were dipping low enough that the air felt sharp if you stayed out too late. I'd planned on getting a long hike in that day and maybe watching the sun go down from one of the ridgelines I liked. I left just after lunch and figured I'd be back well before dark. I took one of the longer loops that went off the main trails. Nothing official, just a path that had been worn down over time by deer, maybe hunters, maybe people like me who preferred not to walk the same routes over and over again. The ground was dry and the leaves had started to fall, so everything underfoot was that satisfying crunch and rustle. I remember it being calm, no wind. The sun filtered through the trees just right. It was peaceful. About an hour and a half in, I came up over a slope that I didn't remember. It was strange. Not that I'd never seen it, but that I'd never noticed it. The woods there were a little thicker, and it looked like the land dipped down into a shallow basin beyond it. I figured I'd follow it and see where it led. That's how these hikes usually went. I'd find something new and then slowly loop back the long way. As I followed the slope down, I noticed something off to the right. A gap in the trees that looked too clean to be natural. The brush was pressed down. A trail of sorts. Not an animal trail either. Wider, worn by boots. Maybe an old four-wheeler or cart at some point. I followed it. The path wound between tight trees, curving slightly, and after maybe 50 feet it opened into a clearing. It wasn't like the forest had just stopped. It looked cleared, like someone had deliberately pushed back the brush and saplings to make space. The sunlight filtered in more directly here, and that's when I saw it. A small camp, not like a modern campsite or a backpacker's setup. This was something else. There were a few structures, shelters, really built from scavenged materials. Tarps, branches, bits of metal siding, old blankets stretched between trunks. A fire pit sat at the center, blackened and surrounded by charred wood. One of the makeshift walls had graffiti sprayed on it, faded letters and symbols I didn't recognize. Another had what looked like coat hangers twisted into shapes and nailed into the trees. I stopped and stared. It wasn't new. This place had been here a while. Long enough to settle, but not so long that it was falling apart. Some of the blankets still looked clean. One shelter had a pair of boots sitting outside of it, pointed out like someone had just stepped out of them. I stepped into the clearing. It felt wrong, but I couldn't help myself. I walked slow, careful. I kept telling myself maybe it was an abandoned camp. Maybe some squatters or transients had stayed here a while and moved on. That wasn't unusual around here. The woods had long been a place for people to disappear into, if they didn't want to be found. I passed one shelter and looked inside. A foam mattress laid out on top of a shipping pallet. Empty bottles in the corner. A cracked mirror nailed to a trunk. There was a coat hung on a nail, still holding its shape. I noticed a pack of crackers and an open can of beans on a plastic crate. Fresh. I moved to the fire pit. It was dead, but not cold. There was still a little warmth in the ash. I didn't touch it, but I could see it. Someone had been here, maybe recently, maybe minutes ago. Suddenly, the quiet hit me. It wasn't just still, it was absolute.
No birds. No bugs.
No wind. Nothing. I stood frozen, listening. I could hear my own breath, my heartbeat. Nothing else. I looked around again. Not just at the camp this time, but at the trees beyond it. That's when the realization crept in. I wasn't alone. It hit me all at once. That crawling, skin-tight feeling that you're being watched. Like a weight behind your eyes that you can't shake off. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. But I knew, as surely as I've ever known anything, that someone was out there, watching me. I turned slowly, scanning the woods. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow too deep. There was no movement, but I could feel it. Someone had heard me coming. Maybe more than one. They'd moved back, melted into the trees, and waited, hidden just far enough that I couldn't see them. But they could see me. They were probably watching the whole time I poked through their camp. Probably had been the moment I stepped onto that beaten path. I wasn't sneaky. I'd made noise, walked right in like I owned the place. My mouth was dry. My heart was in my throat. I didn't want to run. I didn't want to panic. But I wanted to leave. Fast. I backed out slowly, step by step. I didn't look behind me until I was back to the slope. Then I turned and walked. Not fast, not slow, just steady. It was like walking through molasses. Every tree felt like it had eyes. Every sound or lack of sound felt like a hand tightening around my neck. The crunch of leaves under my boots was suddenly deafening. When I finally hit the main trail again, the sun was low. The sky had gone gold and blue and the light was starting to fail. I kept walking. No break.
No pause.
I didn't stop until I was at my car. Even then, I didn't feel safe. I sat there in the driver's seat for a long time. The woods were still. The trailhead was empty. I didn't see anyone, but I kept checking the rearview mirror the whole way home. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those shelters, the fire pit, the boots, and the feeling of being watched. It wasn't imagination. It was too strong, too sharp. I'd felt eyes on me before, at night in cities, in parking garages, on empty streets. This was the same, only quieter, older, deeper. The next day, I considered going back. Part of me wanted to see if it was real. Maybe it had all been some weird trick of light and nerves. Maybe I'd read too many stories online. But something in me said no. Stay away. They didn't want to be found. I'd found them. That was enough. In the weeks after, I did more digging. Quietly, I asked around at the diner, checked some old forums, looked at archived local papers. A few stories here and there. People going missing. Hikers getting turned around. A hunter once talked about seeing strange signs deep in the woods. Symbols carved into trees, shoes hung high up in the branches. Rumors, but they matched what I'd seen. I never reported anything. I didn't even tell friends. What would I say? I walked into someone's hidden camp and got scared? I didn't know if they were dangerous. They didn't chase me, didn't make a sound, but they let me leave. That was the part that stuck with me. They let me leave. They were out there watching me, from the trees, silent, still, close, and they chose not to do anything. Maybe they just wanted to be left alone. Maybe I wasn't the first person to find them. Maybe I wasn't the first person to leave. Maybe I was just the first one to notice. I still hike now, but only on marked trails. I stay close to other people. I go early in the day. I tell someone where I'm going. It's not fear exactly. It's respect. Because out there, just past where the path fades, there are places people live without being seen. Camps without addresses. Shelters without names. People who slip back into the woods when they hear you coming. And if you're lucky, they'll just watch and let you go. I've always been the kind of person who doesn't really mind being alone. Not in the brooding or dramatic sense, just someone who functions well in their own company. When I go hiking, that's usually how it is. Just me, a pack with the essentials, and a stretch of trail where I don't have to make small talk or worry about anything but the next step. The woods behind my town stretch for miles. Not part of a national park or a famous system, just old, dense forest. Mostly pine and oak. Some parts have rough trails, old service roads, forgotten logging paths, and game trails winding deeper than most people care to go. Over time, I've learned to ignore the well-trodden paths. I like going farther out where the brush is thicker and you're less likely to cross paths with anyone. It's always been about the quiet for me. There's something about it. No traffic noise, no voices, no cell reception. Just trees creaking in the breeze, the occasional flutter of wings, the steady rhythm of footfalls on dirt and leaves. It helps me reset, keeps my head clear. On this particular hike, I plan to go deeper into a corner of the woods I'd only touched once or twice before. I remember it was late September. The leaves had just started turning, and the air had that cool edge that lets you know summer's over. I left around 2 in the afternoon, knowing I had at least 4 hours of good light. I didn't expect to stay out long. I had a rough idea of where I was going, a mental map of the hills and dry creek beds that marked the terrain out there. I packed light, some water, a flashlight, a snack, a knife, a basic first aid kit. I figured I'd be back before dusk. I parked along the side of an old gravel road where some hunters usually leave their trucks. No other cars that day. I crossed the ditch, moved through the tree line, and slipped into the forest. For the first hour, it was perfect. The trail I took wasn't really a trail so much as a depression in the forest floor. Likely an old runoff path that had turned into an unofficial walkway over the years. The ground was dry and crunchy with leaves. The trees were spaced in a way that let the light reach the forest floor in long golden beams. The breeze was light, and the only real noise was the distant cawing of a crow somewhere deeper in. The terrain started to slope upward after a while. That wasn't unusual. This section of forest had a few low ridges, but I didn't remember it being quite that steep from my earlier hikes. Still, I followed it, thinking I'd get a good vantage point at the top. When I got there, though, something felt different. The trees were tighter, older. Their trunks were scarred with old fire marks and lichen. The wind didn't make it this high, or maybe the trees blocked it. Everything felt still, like the forest was holding its breath. I rested at the top of the ridge, drank some water, and ate half an energy bar. Then I kept going. I figured I'd go down the other side, follow the low ground back out toward a dried-up creek I knew eventually looped near where I parked. As I descended, I noticed something off the path, a kind of unnatural shape low to the ground, maybe 40 feet away. It wasn't an animal or a rock. It had right angles, sharp lines. I walked over, stepping around some low brush and fallen branches. That's when I saw it. A small camp, old but not abandoned. It was built into a low hollow at the base of the ridge. The trees were denser here, forming a kind of natural curtain around the area. The camp itself wasn't big. 3 shelters made from tarps, rotting plywood, branches, and plastic. One of them had a door made from a car's backseat. Another had clotheslines strung between trees, with shirts and pants that looked faded but still intact. A few old boots were lined up beside one of the shelters, and there was a big, rusted pot half buried in the dirt beside a burnt-out fire pit. But what caught my attention was how lived in it all looked. It wasn't just a forgotten place. This wasn't some teenager's hangout or an old survivalist's abandoned camp. The fire pit still had blackened wood in it. The boots weren't falling apart. The clothes didn't have holes or stains from years of weather. One of the tarps was fairly new, clean, taut, not sagging like the others. Somebody had been here. Recently. I stood there just outside the clearing trying to process it. A homeless camp, maybe. That was the logical answer. Someone living way off the grid. Avoiding town, avoiding people. That wasn't unheard of around here. I'd heard stories of people doing just that. Some with mental health issues, some who'd lost everything, some who just didn't want to be found. I told myself I'd only take a quick look. I wasn't trying to snoop. I just felt like I had to understand it. I stepped into the clearing. The silence was immediate, heavy.
No birdsong.
No wind. Just the quiet hum of my own body, breath, heart. The crunch of my boot on dry leaves. I walked over to the fire pit, crouched and touched the ash. Still a bit warm. That's when my stomach dropped. It meant whoever was here had been here recently. Maybe even still nearby. Maybe they saw me come in. I stood and scanned the treeline. Nothing moved. No sound. Just still trees. Then I noticed something that hadn't clicked right away. A small piece of paper nailed to one of the trees near the biggest shelter. It wasn't official. Just torn notebook paper, maybe water-stained, but still readable. There were marks on it. A few letters, maybe numbers. I walked over. As I got closer, I stopped. There were more pieces of paper nailed up higher where the bark met the branches. Like warnings, or signals. I couldn't make sense of them, but I started getting that feeling. The one you get when you realize you're not where you're supposed to be. The kind of internal alarm that doesn't have a clear cause, just a deep pull in your chest that says go back. I stepped back. My eyes swept the tree line again. Still no movement, but I felt it. That tight sensation behind the eyes. The coldness across the back of my neck. I was being watched. I don't mean in the paranoia sense. I mean watched. The kind of attention that prickles your skin, that sets your instincts on fire. I didn't know where it was coming from, but I could feel it, clear as anything. I'd wandered too far, seen too much, and now someone was deciding what to do about it. I didn't run. I just turned and walked, fast but steady, back the way I came. I didn't look behind me. I knew if I did, I'd probably see something I didn't want to. The forest was still quiet, too quiet, like everything else had stopped to let something else move. It took longer than I remembered to get back to the ridge. My legs felt heavy, My pack felt wrong on my shoulders, like it was pressing down harder than normal. I kept thinking I heard movement behind me, but every time I stopped, there was nothing. Stillness. Deep, unnatural stillness. By the time I made it to the ridge, the sun was low. The shadows had stretched out across the ground like long fingers, and the light filtering through the trees was cold and pale. I didn't stop. I followed my original path down, back toward the car. I made it out without seeing anyone, or anything, but that feeling of being followed, of eyes on me, stayed with me the whole way. When I got back to my car, there were no other vehicles. No signs that anyone else had come or gone. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and sat there with the engine off for 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to slow down, trying to make sense of what had happened. Nothing dramatic.
No confrontation.
No threat, but someone had been there, and they'd seen me. They probably saw me the second I stepped into that hollow. Maybe earlier. Maybe they heard me from 100 yards away, watched as I poked around their camp, as I touched their fire pit, looked at their things, read their signs. They didn't stop me, didn't yell, didn't show themselves. They just watched, and that's what unsettled me the most. The silence, the restraint, the choice. I didn't go back to that part of the forest. Ever. I still hike, still go out alone, but not there. Not anymore. Sometimes, when I'm walking a familiar trail and the woods go quiet, I remember that day. The way the trees closed in. The warmth in the ash. The symbols on the trees. The feeling of being noticed, marked. And I wonder how many others have walked too far off the trail, crossed some invisible line in the dirt, and found something that wasn't meant for them. Something that watched them leave and let them go. When I was in college in the early 2000s, I went through a phase where I felt invincible. I didn't have a better word for it then, but looking back, I can call it what it really was, young and stupid. I had just enough experience in the woods to think I knew what I was doing, but not nearly enough to realize how fast things could go wrong. I was going to school in the North Georgia mountains at the time. Not some tiny college in the middle of nowhere, but rural enough that the campus was surrounded by thick forests and endless trails. It was the kind of place where you could walk 5 minutes from a dorm and not hear another person. A lot of students hiked, especially at night. Night hiking was actually pretty common around there. The area felt peaceful and safe, almost like nature was part of the campus itself. Everyone did it, and because nothing bad ever seemed to happen, we all just assumed we were good to go as long as we brought a flashlight and stayed on the trail. By the time this happened, I had probably done 24 night hikes with friends. Easy trails, a couple miles long, sometimes even in flip-flops. I got cocky, comfortable. I started to think I understood the woods out there. I didn't. This night started out like something out of a dream. It was early fall, still warm but not muggy. Clear skies, full moon. I remember being in my dorm, restless and bored, and deciding to do something with the energy. I had smoked a little earlier, just a puff or two. Nothing that would knock me out, just enough to get that mellow edge. I didn't want to go to a party, and none of my friends were around, so I grabbed my little hiking pack and drove out to one of the closer trailheads. This trail wasn't anything extreme. About a mile-long loop through the woods with no major elevation gain, following an old logging path that curved in a wide circle and ended up right back at the trailhead. Nothing fancy. I had walked it dozens of times. It was public land, not maintained by the state but known among students and locals. Remote enough that you never saw strangers, but close enough to town that you didn't feel like you were risking your life just going out there. That's what I told myself, anyway. I brought a flashlight, but I barely needed it. The moon was so bright everything was tinted silver blue. The trail was clear underfoot, and the forest around me had this quiet, still energy that made everything feel surreal. That's the best way I can describe it. I was alone, but not lonely. The woods weren't loud, but they weren't dead quiet either. I could hear leaves moving in the breeze, maybe the rustle of a squirrel or two, the occasional owl. All normal stuff. I walked slow, not in any rush, taking it in. The trees on either side of the path looked like black shadows stacked against each other. The moonlight came through in these broken patterns, like a patchwork. Every now and then I'd stop, close my eyes, and just listen. I liked that, standing still in the dark, surrounded by nothing but woods, letting the quiet wrap around me. It made the world feel bigger, and I felt like a part of it. That feeling didn't last. I was maybe 3/4 of the way through the loop, just starting to angle back toward the trailhead, when something shifted. I can't explain exactly what changed, only that I felt it. Like the air had been replaced by something heavier. Still the same temperature, still the same breeze, but the space around me didn't feel open anymore. I stopped walking and listened. It was just the woods, but it wasn't. I strained my ears and heard something, faint and low. I thought it might be a wind shift or a far-off animal at first, but it came again, this time clearer. A voice, far off but human. It was a man, and he was crying. I stood there in the dark, totally still, trying to understand what I was hearing. The sound wasn't close. It was coming from the right side of the trail, off in the woods. Maybe 100 feet away, maybe more. Far enough that it was faint, but not so far I couldn't make it out. He was sobbing, not yelling, not shouting for help, just crying. The kind of crying that comes out of your throat without control. Sharp, choking sounds like someone had just been hit with the worst news of their life. But there was something else to it, too. Something off. It was the way the crying sounded. Stretched, like it had been going on too long, like he wasn't breathing right. I could hear his voice shaking, slipping into gibberish between sobs, like broken sentences without words. My first instinct was to move toward it. That sounds dumb now, but that's who I was back then. If someone needed help, you helped them. That's how I was raised. But something stopped me. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was more like a warning that started in my gut. I felt it before I could even process what it meant. Like my body knew something that my brain hadn't caught up with. I took one step forward, then froze. I looked down at my feet. The gravel on the trail had been crunching under me the whole time, loud in the stillness. The sound of my boots, the twigs, the leaves, all the things I hadn't been thinking about suddenly mattered. Because the second I made a sound, I'd no longer be alone in the woods with that crying. He'd know I was there. The sound continued, low, frantic, uneven. And then it got stranger. The crying didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It just stayed the same. No rise and fall. No changes in pitch. No coughs. No sniffing. Just this endless, looping sound. Not quite robotic, but not right either. Like someone who had been crying too long and had lost control of their voice. Sounded real, but broken. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, barely breathing, listening to that sound. And then I turned around. I didn't run. I didn't even walk fast at first. I just moved back down the trail the same way I had come. I tried to step where I had already stepped before to avoid snapping twigs. I didn't use my flashlight. The moonlight was enough. My heart was racing. I kept telling myself not to panic, not to overthink, that it was just some man out there. Maybe he was high. Maybe he was in trouble. Maybe he was just mentally ill. But the voice in my head, the one I always ignored, was screaming now. He doesn't want help. He doesn't want to be found. He wants you to come off the trail. And if you make a sound, he'll know where you are. I kept moving, slow and careful, all my focus zeroed in on keeping quiet. Every few seconds, I'd stop and listen. The crying was still going. It wasn't getting louder, but it wasn't getting farther either. It just stayed at the same distance, as if it was tracking me. I started to wonder if he was moving too. That's when fear really set in. Not the jump scare kind, the cold, crawling kind. The kind that makes your body feel too small. My head was spinning. I couldn't remember how far I was from the car. Half a mile? A quarter? Every tree looked the same. Every shadow looked like a person crouching low. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes, I saw the trailhead. It was just a dark opening between two trees, but I recognized it. I remember almost breaking into a run, but stopping myself. I told myself over and over, just a little farther. Just keep moving. Keep quiet. I stepped off the trail and onto the gravel pull-off. My car was the only one there. No trucks, no signs of anyone else. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Then I sat there, just breathing. My hands were shaking. I hadn't realized how tight I'd been gripping my pack. My throat was dry. My ears were still ringing from how hard I'd been focusing. I didn't drive off right away. I just sat there with the windows up, listening. But I didn't hear the crying anymore. It had stopped, and I still don't know if that's better or worse. Eventually, I drove back to campus. The whole way, I expected to see headlights pop up behind me. I kept checking the mirror. Every turn in the road felt like something was going to jump out. When I parked at the dorm, I just sat there for a while, breathing. The panic hit in waves, not all at once, like my body was processing what had happened in pieces. My mind went over every second, every step, every sound. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I had spoken, if I had called out, if I had turned on my flashlight, if I had gone 20 feet off the trail. That's what gets me the most. The sound had been so human, so pitiful, and still every cell in my body had told me to get away. I never went back to that trail. I told a couple friends about it, and they said it was probably a transient, maybe a local off his meds. But even they agreed something wasn't right about the way it happened. I didn't imagine it. I wasn't that high. I wasn't dreaming. I was there, and something else was too. To this day, I don't feel guilty for leaving him there. I know I probably should, but I don't. That feeling in my gut was real. Whatever I heard out there that night, it wasn't going to end well for me if I got closer. The woods don't care who you are. They don't care how smart or prepared or experienced you think you are. And sometimes neither do the people who hide in them. I've never really been the type to scare easy. I grew up camping, hiking, and fishing in national forests, deep into places without cell signal, without roads, without any backup if things went wrong. I knew the difference between normal wilderness noise and something out of place. But even with all that experience, I've never shaken the feeling I got that night. It wasn't ghosts or monsters or anything like that. It was just people, real people, doing something they didn't want others to see. And the way they got us out of there still makes the hair on my arms stand up when I think about it. This happened about 4 years ago on a 3-day weekend trip in Central Oregon. My friends and I, there were 6 of us in total, 3 guys and 3 girls, were all in our early 30s at the time. We weren't partiers or anything. We just liked the quiet. We all worked busy, stressful jobs and made it a point to take a couple trips every year to places where there were no crowds and no cell towers. That weekend, we chose a spot none of us had ever been to. It was on BLM land, technically public and open for dispersed camping. We found it by studying satellite imagery and topo maps. There was a Forest Service road that snaked way back off a highway, crossed a ridge, and eventually led to a wide, grassy clearing tucked against a river. It looked perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, no visible signs of nearby use. We figured it'd be ours alone for the weekend. The drive-in was rough, a solid hour down a dirt road that hadn't seen much maintenance in years. Deep ruts, overgrown bushes on either side, narrow enough that we had to crawl in first gear in a couple spots. We took 3 cars, 2 SUVs and a Subaru Outback. When we finally got to the clearing, it looked even better than the satellite had shown. Big open space, trees all around, fire pit already made, and not a single beer can or shotgun shell in sight. That's rare for BLM land, and we took it as a good omen. We set up camp late that afternoon. No one else was around. No other tire tracks. No sounds of engines in the distance. We were out there. That night was great. A big fire, a simple meal, some whiskey, and a sky so clear it looked fake. Around 10, we started winding down. We weren't party animals, just tired professionals enjoying the quiet. And then something small happened that, at the time, didn't even seem important. One of the girls, Jess, walked out to her car to grab her headlamp and came back a minute later with a weird look on her face. She said one of her rear windows was halfway down. She hadn't remembered leaving it that way, but it was her car, and she figured maybe she just forgot. I didn't think twice about it. Next morning, we got up, made coffee, and prepped to hike a side trail that we'd spotted nearby. Before we left, we walked over to the cars to grab our day packs. That's when we saw it. The front right tire on all 3 cars had been slashed. Not blown, not flat from a slow leak. Slashed. Same spot on each one, dead center of the sidewall, clean incision, like someone used the exact same tool on each tire. It didn't hit us right away. I remember just standing there, blinking at it, waiting for the logical explanation. Maybe something on the road? Some sharp rock or rusted metal we all hit by accident. But there was no way. Same tire, same damage, on all 3 cars. We hadn't driven side by side. There was no trail debris like that. No chance it was an accident. That realization hit like a truck. Everyone just stood there for a minute, looking around the trees, suddenly hyper-aware of how far we were from anything or anyone who could help. I'm telling you, it was like a switch flipped in the group. 1 second, we were relaxed and laughing about nature. The next, every single one of us was dead quiet, scanning the tree line like we were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, felt real, like someone was out there, like someone had already been close enough to us, close enough to slash 3 tires without us ever hearing them. After a minute, someone said, "Maybe it's just a prank," but even they didn't sound convinced. The mood changed completely. We were spooked. Bad. We all carried spares, thank God. Not full-size tires, just those little donuts, but enough to get us back to the highway. One guy, Dave, had a handgun in his pack, legal, licensed. He kept it holstered but ready. He stood watch while the rest of us quietly and quickly swapped out the flats. The whole time, no one spoke above a whisper. We kept glancing over our shoulders. No one wanted to be the one facing the woods. We changed all 3 tires in under half an hour. Fastest I've ever seen that done. Then we loaded the essentials, water, first aid, some food, and got in the cars. The plan was simple. Drive out, get to town, and figure out what to do. Maybe report it, maybe not. Just get out of there. As we rolled out of the clearing, Jess said something over the walkie we were using to stay in touch between cars. She'd spotted something, just a quick flash, off to the right near the tree line. Tarp, maybe, or plastic sheeting. We didn't stop to check. We just kept moving. The drive out was slower than the drive in. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every time a branch moved in the wind, I flinched. We didn't see another person the whole way. Once we hit pavement again, the tension dropped like a stone. Everyone finally exhaled. We found the nearest gas station, topped off the tires, and took turns standing in line to use the bathroom like nothing had happened. We debated reporting it, but what could we even say? Someone slashed our tires in the woods. That's not a crime scene. That's not an emergency. That's just unfortunate. We had no photos of the damage, no evidence, no suspects, and no proof of intent. So we drove home. A few weeks later, I was still thinking about it, still trying to figure out who would have been out there, what they were doing, and why they went through the effort of slashing tires but didn't steal anything or confront us. I spent hours digging into satellite images and Forest Service maps. That's when I saw it. About 1.5 miles south of where we camped, the trees broke into a pattern. Not random, not natural, straight lines, rectangles, like plots. You don't see that in wild forest. I zoomed in as far as the grainy image would let me, and I was almost sure of it. Rows, covered in some kind of netting. Grow ops. Illegal marijuana grow operations have existed in national forests and BLM land for years. Cartel-run or just off-grid growers. They pick remote places, cut irrigation hoses into creeks, and defend their spots without ever being seen. Some of them rig the areas with traps. Others just watch and wait. We must have gotten close. Too close. We didn't stumble onto the grow itself, but we were on the edge of their zone. Maybe our campsite was one of the only flat spots in the area. Maybe it was just a natural stopping point, but it was too close for their comfort. And what's the cleanest way to get someone to leave without drawing attention? You don't threaten them. You don't fire a warning shot. You just scare them, slash their tires. Not deep enough to trap them. Just enough to make them panic and leave on their own. Just enough to keep the cops from ever being called. Just enough to make sure nobody ever comes back. And it worked. I've done dozens of camping trips since then, and I've never gone that deep without backup again. Never parked without keeping a camera on the car. Never gone to a site unless I'm certain of what's around it. Because the scariest part of that whole experience wasn't that someone got close without us noticing. It was that they let us know they were there, and then they let us go.